There are moments in life when everything you believed in crumbles like sand slipping through your fingers, when the people you trusted most become strangers wearing familiar faces, when a single decision strips away your dignity and leaves you standing in the ruins of what you thought was your future. This is the story of a man who lost everything in one devastating afternoon, a father who was punished for wanting to hold his newborn child, a loyal employee who discovered that loyalty meant nothing when profit was on the line, and an ordinary person who transformed betrayal into the sweetest revenge the business world had ever witnessed. It is a tale of humiliation turned into triumph, of weakness forged into unbreakable strength, of a family torn apart by corporate greed and rebuilt through determination that burned hotter than any fury. What began as the worst day of his life became the first page of a legend that would echo through boardrooms and family dinners for generations to come. Marcus Chen had been working at Davidson Technologies for 7 years, climbing from a junior developer to the head of the entire software development division, pouring his soul into every project and sacrificing countless evenings and weekends to meet impossible deadlines that his superiors demanded without mercy. His wife Sarah was 9 months pregnant with their first child, her belly round and full with the promise of new life, and they had spent months preparing the nursery in their small apartment, painting the walls a soft yellow and assembling furniture with trembling hands and hearts full of hope. Marcus had submitted his paternity leave request 3 months in advance, following every protocol and procedure outlined in the employee handbook, filling out the forms with meticulous care, and receiving approval from his direct supervisor who had smiled and congratulated him warmly. The morning Sarah went into labor, Marcus was in the middle of a crucial presentation to potential investors, but when his phone buzzed with her panicked message that her water had broken, he immediately excused himself and rushed to the hospital with his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. Their daughter Emma was born at 3:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in October, arriving into the world with a fierce cry that seemed to announce her determination to make her presence known. And when Marcus held her tiny body for the first time, feeling her impossibly small fingers wrap around his thumb, he wept openly with a joy so overwhelming it felt like his chest might explode. Sarah looked exhausted but radiant, her hair damp with sweat and her eyes shining with a love so pure it seemed to illuminate the entire delivery room, and Marcus kissed her forehead gently while whispering promises about the beautiful life they would build together as a family. The next morning, still floating in the golden haze of new fatherhood, Marcus called his office to officially begin his paternity leave, expecting the routine confirmation and well wishes that any decent workplace would offer. Instead, his supervisor Karen sounded uncomfortable and distant, her voice tight with an emotion Marcus could not quite identify, and she asked him to hold while she transferred him to human resources without offering any explanation. The HR director, a woman named Patricia who had always been coldly professional, delivered the news with mechanical efficiency that suggested she had practiced this speech many times before. Marcus was being terminated effective immediately for abandoning his post during critical business operations, for failing to fulfill his responsibilities to the company, and for demonstrating a lack of commitment that made him unsuitable for his position. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways as confusion and disbelief crashed over him like an icy wave, and he stammered that he had approved leave, that he had followed every procedure, that his wife had just given birth to their daughter. Patricia responded in a voice devoid of empathy that his leave request had been retroactively denied by the CEO himself, that the company needed someone reliable in his position, and that his personal life could not be allowed to interfere with business priorities. The call ended abruptly, leaving Marcus standing in the hospital corridor with his phone still pressed to his ear, his mind unable to process the cruelty of what had just happened, while his newborn daughter slept peacefully in the room behind him. Richard Davison, the founder and CEO of Davison Technologies, had built his fortune on the backs of talented employees like Marcus, extracting every ounce of creativity and effort from his workforce while offering minimal compensation and treating people as disposable resources rather than human beings with families and dreams. Marcus had met Davison only a handful of times during his 7 years at the company, brief encounters in elevators or company events where the CEO would offer a perfunctory handshake and a smile that never reached his cold gray eyes. Davison had a reputation for ruthlessness that employees whispered about in break rooms and parking lots, stories of workers fired for taking sick days to care for dying parents, of mothers denied flexible schedules after returning from maternity leave, of talented professionals discarded the moment they became inconvenient. Marcus had always told himself these were exaggerations, that surely no one could be that heartless, but now he understood with bitter clarity that the stories had been understated, if anything. When Marcus demanded a meeting to appeal his termination, speaking with a desperation that made his voice crack and shake, he was granted 15 minutes in Davison's corner office 3 days after Emma's birth, 3 days during which Sarah had cried herself to sleep each night, while Marcus lay awake, calculating their savings and wondering how they would survive. Davison sat behind a massive mahogany desk that cost more than Marcus's annual salary, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, and his silver hair impeccably styled, and he barely glanced up from his computer screen when Marcus entered. Marcus began to explain his situation with words that tumbled out in a frantic rush, describing Sarah's difficult pregnancy, Emma's perfect tiny face, the paternity leave approval he had received, the plans they had made based on the company's own policies. Davison listened with an expression of profound boredom, occasionally checking his phone and sighing as if Marcus was wasting precious time that could be spent on more important matters. When Marcus finally fell silent, his plea hanging in the air between them like smoke, Davison leaned back in his leather chair and delivered a speech that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life, every word carved into his memory like scars on stone. The CEO explained in a patronizing tone that businesses required sacrifice, that employees who prioritized family over company were fundamentally unsuitable for leadership positions, and that Marcus should be grateful for the 7 years of employment he had received rather than complaining about policies that the company could change whenever business needs demanded. Davison added with a thin smile that perhaps Marcus was not cut out for the corporate world, that maybe he should focus on being a stay-at-home father, since he clearly valued diaper changes more than professional achievement, and that dwelling on this decision was pointless, because the termination was final and non-negotiable. Marcus felt rage surge through his veins like molten metal, hot and consuming, but he forced himself to remain calm and asked in a quiet voice what he had done to deserve such treatment after years of dedicated service. Davison's smile widened into something cruel and dismissive as he said that Marcus had committed the cardinal sin of being replaceable, and that the world was full of talented programmers who would gladly take his position without the burden of family obligations. Marcus left that office with his hands trembling and his vision blurred by tears of fury and humiliation, taking the elevator down 40 floors while trying to breathe through the crushing weight on his chest that made it feel like his ribs were collapsing inward. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, and then he screamed until his throat was raw and aching. Sarah was waiting for him at home with Emma cradled in her arms, and when she saw his face, she knew immediately that the meeting had not gone well. that their lives had just become infinitely more difficult than they had imagined possible. Marcus held his wife and daughter close while explaining what Davison had said, repeating the CEO's cruel words about being replaceable and prioritizing diaper changes. And Sarah wept against his shoulder, while Emma made soft, cooing sounds that seemed to ask why her parents were so sad. The next weeks were a blur of rejection and desperation, as Marcus sent out hundreds of job applications while trying to help Sarah with Emma, surviving on their rapidly dwindling savings and the charity of family members who offered money with pitying expressions that made Marcus want to crawl into a hole and disappear. Every interview seemed to go well until the potential employer contacted Davison Technologies for a reference, and then Marcus would receive a polite rejection email citing concerns about his professionalism or reliability, coded language that told him Davison was poisoning every opportunity out of pure spite. Sarah's mother suggested that Marcus sue for wrongful termination, but lawyers explained that Davison Technologies had expensive legal teams and unlimited resources, that the company had structured his termination to be technically legal even if morally reprehensible, and that a lawsuit would drain their remaining savings without guaranteeing any victory. Marcus felt himself sinking into a dark place where hope seemed like a cruel joke, where the future stretched ahead like an endless desert with no water in sight, where every glance at Emma's innocent face filled him with shame that he could not provide for his daughter. One night, while Sarah and Emma slept, Marcus sat at his laptop in the kitchen with a single light burning overhead, scrolling through job postings with dead eyes and a heart full of despair. His email inbox held another dozen rejections, each one a reminder of his failure, each one proof that Davison had destroyed not just his current position but his entire career. Marcus clicked on a news article almost by accident, something about startup success stories, and he read about young entrepreneurs who had built companies from nothing in garages and spare bedrooms, who had taken their skills and determination and created something the world had never seen before. The article mentioned that the most successful startups often came from people who had been rejected by traditional companies, people who had been told they were not good enough and had responded by proving everyone wrong in spectacular fashion. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a tiny spark of an idea that began to glow brighter with each passing second, and for the first time since Emma's birth, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he was not begging for employment, but creating something entirely his own. Marcus spent the next 3 months teaching himself everything he could about starting a technology company while caring for Emma during the day, and working through the night on 4 hours of sleep, fueled by coffee and a burning determination that had transformed his despair into focused energy. He used the connections he had made during his 7 years at Davison Technologies, reaching out to former colleagues who had also been mistreated by the company, talented programmers and designers who jumped at the chance to build something new with someone who would treat them like human beings rather than disposable tools. Marcus's brother-in-law agreed to invest $20,000 in exchange for a small equity stake, money that seemed impossibly generous and terrifying all at once, and Sarah threw herself into helping with business planning and marketing despite being exhausted from late-night feedings and diaper changes. They named the company VentureTech and filed the incorporation papers on the same day Emma learned to smile, that beautiful moment when their daughter's face lit up with joy, feeling like a blessing and a promise that better days were coming. The first year was brutal beyond anything Marcus had imagined, filled with endless setbacks and near disasters that threatened to destroy the fragile company before it could establish itself in the marketplace. Marcus and his small team worked from a cramped office space above a dry cleaner, the smell of chemicals drifting up through the floorboards while they coded software solutions and pitched potential clients with presentations polished through countless rehearsals. They landed their first contract with a mid-sized healthcare company that needed custom database software, a project that paid barely enough to cover expenses, but gave them a portfolio piece and a reference that opened other doors. Marcus discovered that he was good at running a business in ways he had never been allowed to demonstrate at Davison Technologies, that treating employees with respect and flexibility created loyalty and innovation far beyond what fear and exploitation could achieve. He instituted policies that guaranteed parental leave for all employees regardless of gender, that allowed flexible schedules for people caring for family members, that recognized workers as whole human beings rather than just sources of productivity. VentureTech grew slowly but steadily through word of mouth and reputation, attracting both clients who appreciated their innovative solutions and employees who had been burned by companies like Davison Technologies. Marcus hired people who had been fired for taking care of sick children, who had been passed over for promotions because they refused to sacrifice their marriages to corporate demands, who had been told they were too compassionate or too family-oriented to succeed in the cutthroat business world. This team of wounded warriors worked with a passion and creativity that astonished clients and competitors alike, developing software that was more elegant and effective than anything their larger rivals produced. By the end of the second year, VentureTech had 15 employees and annual revenue of $3 million, and by the end of the third year, they had 30 employees and revenue of $10 million, numbers that seemed impossible when Marcus remembered sitting in that hospital corridor listening to Patricia end his career with cold efficiency. Marcus had deliberately avoided thinking about Davison Technologies during those first 3 years, pouring all his energy into building VentureTech and raising Emma, who had grown into a bright and curious toddler with her mother's laugh and her father's determination. Sarah had returned to her own career as a graphic designer, working part-time from home and finding a balance that made her happy and fulfilled in ways her previous full-time position never had. The Chen family had moved from their small apartment into a modest house with a yard where Emma could play, nothing extravagant but comfortable, and filled with the warmth of a family that had survived crisis and emerged stronger. Marcus sometimes allowed himself to feel pride in what he had accomplished. This company built from rage and rejection that now provided good jobs and quality services. This team of people who trusted him because he had earned that trust through consistent action rather than corporate authority. Then Marcus received an email from Karen, his former supervisor at Davison Technologies, the woman who had transferred him to HR on that terrible morning 4 years ago. Karen wrote that she had left the company 6 months earlier after Davison had denied her own medical leave when she needed surgery, that she had thought of Marcus often over the years with guilt and regret, and that she wanted to meet for coffee to explain what had really happened and to apologize for her role in his termination. Marcus's first instinct was to delete the message without responding, to leave the past buried and focus on the future, but something compelled him to agree to the meeting, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps a need to understand why his life had been destroyed so casually. They met at a quiet cafe downtown on a rainy afternoon, and Karen looked older and more tired than Marcus remembered, her face lined with stress, and her eyes carrying the weight of too many compromises and moral failures. Karen explained that Marcus's termination had been planned weeks before Emma's birth, that Davison had wanted to eliminate his position to cut costs, and had simply been waiting for an excuse that would minimize the risk of a lawsuit. When Marcus had submitted his paternity leave request, Davison had seen an opportunity to frame the termination as abandonment rather than downsizing, to paint Marcus as unprofessional rather than admitting the company was eliminating positions to inflate quarterly profits. Karen said she had argued against the decision, had pointed out that Marcus was one of their most talented employees, and that his departure would hurt ongoing projects, but Davison had overruled her and threatened her own position if she did not cooperate with the plan. She had been a coward, Karen admitted with tears streaming down her face, had chosen to protect her job rather than stand up for what was right, and she had lived with that shame every day since. Marcus listened to this confession with complex emotions swirling in his chest, anger at Karen's complicity, mixed with recognition that corporate cultures of fear created countless small betrayals, and he realized that he no longer cared about assigning blame because he had moved beyond needing validation from his former employer. Karen had brought more than just an apology to their meeting, pulling a folder from her bag and sliding it across the cafe table with hands that shook slightly. Inside were documents that Karen had copied before leaving Davison Technologies, internal memos, and financial reports that painted a disturbing picture of a company in serious trouble despite its outward appearance of success. Davison Technologies had been losing major contracts for the past 2 years, as clients grew frustrated with poor service and outdated software. The company's reputation damaged by high employee turnover and projects that consistently missed deadlines or failed to meet specifications. Davison had been covering the losses with aggressive accounting practices and cutting staff to maintain profit margins, creating a death spiral where reduced capabilities led to more lost clients, which led to more cost-cutting. Karen explained that many of the company's best developers had left for competitors or startups, that the remaining workforce was demoralized and just collecting paychecks while waiting for better opportunities, and that industry insiders were beginning to see Davison Technologies as a dying company clinging to past glory. Marcus studied the documents with the analytical mind that had made him such a valuable employee, seeing patterns and implications that Karen might not have fully understood. Davison Technologies still had some valuable assets, including several major corporate clients who had not yet jumped ship, a portfolio of legacy software that generated steady licensing revenue, and office buildings and equipment that represented significant capital. The company was worth perhaps $40 million if sold as a going concern, but that value was declining rapidly as reputation damage accelerated and talent continued to flee. Marcus felt an idea forming in his mind, wild and audacious, but somehow perfectly fitting, and he asked Karen detailed questions about Davison's ownership structure and debt obligations. Karen did not know all the answers, but she provided enough information for Marcus to begin researching, and by the time they said goodbye, he was already mentally drafting a plan that seemed impossible and inevitable at the same time. VentureTech had just closed a funding round that brought in $15 million from venture capital investors who believed in the company's growth trajectory and ethical business model, money that Marcus had planned to use for expansion and hearing. The company's valuation had reached $35 million based on revenue growth and market potential, a number that made Marcus dizzy when he thought about starting in that office above the dry cleaner. Marcus called an emergency meeting of his board of directors and senior leadership team, gathering in their conference room on a Saturday morning while Sarah watched Emma at home. He presented the information about Davison Technologies' decline and then laid out a proposal that made everyone in the room fall silent with shock. VentureTech should attempt to acquire Davison Technologies, purchasing the failing company and absorbing its assets and remaining clients, turning Marcus's former employer into a division of the business he had built from its ashes. The acquisition would accelerate VentureTech's growth by years, instantly making them a major player in the industry And it would also represent the most complete form of revenge possible, a reversal so total it seemed almost biblical in its symmetry. The board meeting stretched for 4 hours as Marcus and his team analyzed the opportunity from every angle, calculating risks and potential rewards with the same thoroughness they applied to every major decision. Some board members worried that Davison Technologies was too damaged to salvage, that integrating a toxic company culture would poison VentureTech's hard-won reputation for treating employees well. Others argued that the acquisition made perfect business sense, regardless of personal history, that the combined companies would have resources and market presence that could dominate their sector. Marcus's brother-in-law pointed out the poetic justice of the situation with a grin, saying that buying the company that had destroyed Marcus for wanting to be a father would be a story that business schools would teach for decades. Sarah attended the last hour of the meeting and spoke with quiet intensity about how this acquisition could be not just revenge, but transformation, a chance to take a company built on exploitation and remake it into something that honored workers and families, to save the jobs of people still trapped in Davison's toxic culture. The board voted to proceed with due diligence and make a preliminary offer, authorizing Marcus to approach Davison Technologies with a proposal that would use most of their funding round plus additional debt financing. Marcus spent 2 weeks working with lawyers and accountants to structure an offer that would be financially sound, while also delivering the symbolic message he wanted, that victims of corporate cruelty could rise up and purchase their oppressors. The offer letter was a masterpiece of professional business writing that conveyed nothing of the emotional weight behind it, proposing to acquire Davison Technologies for $38 million in a combination of cash and stock, assuming all outstanding debts and obligations, and retaining current employees under new management. Marcus insisted on one personal touch that his lawyers tried to discourage, a single sentence nodding that the offer came from VentureTech's founder and CEO, who had previously worked at Davison Technologies and brought valuable insider knowledge to the transaction. Marcus addressed the envelope himself, writing Richard Davison's name in careful block letters, and he drove to the post office to mail it rather than using a courier service, because he wanted this gesture to be deliberate and personal. He stood at the mailbox for a long moment before dropping the envelope inside, thinking about the 4 years that had passed since that hospital corridor, about Emma's laughter filling their house, about the team of talented people who had trusted him to build something better. The envelope disappeared into the mailbox with a soft thud that sounded like a door closing on one chapter and opening on another. Marcus drove home to find Sarah and Emma baking cookies in the kitchen, flour dusting their faces, and the air filled with the smell of vanilla and chocolate chips, and he joined them without mentioning where he had been, because this moment of simple family joy was what everything had really been about all along. 3 days passed without any response from Davison Technologies, 3 days during which Marcus went about his normal routine of meetings and development reviews, while checking his email obsessively every few minutes. VentureTech had continued growing during the acquisition planning, landing 2 new major contracts that pushed their revenue projections even higher, and Marcus felt grateful that his company had substance beyond his personal vendetta. Emma had started attending a wonderful preschool where teachers encouraged curiosity and creativity, where she was learning to share and make friends with other children, and watching her thrive made Marcus more determined than ever to build a business world where parents could participate in these precious moments without fear of punishment. Sarah had noticed his distraction and asked what was weighing on his mind, and when Marcus explained about the acquisition offer, she had held him tight and whispered that she was proud of him regardless of what happened next, that he had already won by creating a life and company that honored their values. On the fourth day, Marcus received a phone call from Davison's personal assistant requesting a meeting that afternoon to discuss a business matter of mutual interest, the language carefully neutral, but the subtext clear that his offer had generated a response. Marcus drove to the Davison Technologies headquarters in his modest but professional car, parking in the visitor lot, and walking through the lobby, where he had once passed every morning on his way to a job he had loved before it was stolen from him. The building looked shabbier than he remembered, the furniture worn, and the plants wilting slightly, small details that spoke to a company cutting corners on maintenance and appearance. Marcus signed in with the security guard and rode the elevator to the top floor, his heart pounding but his mind clear and focused, prepared for whatever Richard Davison might say or do in response to this audacious offer. Davison's office looked exactly as Marcus remembered it down to the position of the pens on the massive mahogany desk, as if time had frozen in this room, while the world outside transformed completely. The CEO stood by his window overlooking the city, his silver hair still perfectly styled, but his expensive suit hanging slightly looser than Marcus recalled, suggesting weight loss or stress or both. Davison turned when Marcus entered and studied him with eyes that betrayed nothing. No recognition or surprise or anger, just the cold assessment of a businessman evaluating an opponent. Neither man offered to shake hands, both understanding that this meeting existed beyond normal professional courtesies, in a space where personal history and business calculations intersected in uncomfortable ways. Davison gestured to a chair, and Marcus sat down while the CEO remained standing, a power play that Marcus recognized and ignored because he no longer needed to play those games. Davison began the conversation by acknowledging that Marcus had built an impressive company in a relatively short time, his tone suggesting this was an unexpected inconvenience rather than an achievement worth celebrating. The CEO said that he had researched VentureTech thoroughly after receiving the acquisition offer and had been surprised to discover that his former employee had demonstrated entrepreneurial capabilities that had not been apparent during his time at Davison Technologies. Marcus replied calmly that perhaps those capabilities had been apparent, but Davison had never bothered to notice them or create conditions where they could flourish, that treating employees as disposable resources meant never discovering what they might accomplish if given respect and opportunity. Davison's expression tightened slightly at this comment, but he continued in a professional tone, asking what made Marcus think that VentureTech could successfully integrate and turn around a much larger and more established company. Marcus had prepared for this question with the same thoroughness he applied to every major presentation, pulling out financial projections and integration plans that his team had developed over countless hours of analysis. He explained that Davison Technologies had strong bones but diseased flesh, that the core assets and client relationships were valuable, but the toxic culture and mismanagement had created rot that would continue spreading without radical intervention. VentureTech would retain most existing employees while implementing policies that supported work-life balance and professional development, would invest in updating legacy systems and training staff on modern development practices, and would leverage its reputation for quality and ethics to win back clients who had fled to competitors. Marcus walked through numbers and timelines with confidence that came from knowing his analysis was thorough and his vision achievable, watching Davison's face for reactions and seeing the older man's certainty begin to waver as the presentation continued. When Marcus finished, Davison sat down behind his desk for the first time, the gesture suggesting he was ready to engage seriously with the proposal rather than dismiss it out of hand. The CEO admitted that Davison Technologies was facing significant challenges, but argued that the company's brand value and market position were worth far more than Marcus's offer suggested, that $45 million would be a more appropriate price for a firm with such distinguished history and client relationships. Marcus had anticipated this counter and responded that declining revenue and reputational damage had eroded much of that value, that the due diligence process would likely reveal problems that would justify an even lower offer, and that VentureTech was prepared to walk away if the price became unreasonable, because they had plenty of organic growth opportunities. This was calculated brinkmanship, and both men knew it, a dance where Marcus held more cards than Davison wanted to acknowledge, but where the CEO's pride and desperation created unpredictable variables that could derail everything. The negotiation continued for 90 minutes, circling through financial details and strategic considerations, while the personal history between the two men hung in the air like smoke that neither would acknowledge directly. Davison pushed back on every aspect of the offer, questioning VentureTech's ability to execute, suggesting that Marcus lacked the experience to manage a company of Davison Technologies' scale, and implying that the whole acquisition was motivated by childish revenge rather than sound business judgment. Marcus responded to each objection with data and logic, refusing to be drawn into emotional arguments even when Davison's comments became subtly insulting, maintaining the professional demeanor that drove the older man to increasingly obvious frustration. They haggled over price and terms and timelines, moving incrementally toward a structure that might work for both parties, until finally Davison leaned back in his chair and asked the question that had clearly been bothering him throughout the entire discussion. Did Marcus really think he could succeed where Davison himself had struggled, could transform a company that had been built over 3 decades into something that matched VentureTech's idealistic vision? Or was this entire acquisition just an expensive way to settle a personal grudge? The question hung in the air between them, and Marcus understood that his answer would determine whether this deal moved forward or collapsed into mutual destruction. He spoke slowly and carefully, saying that he had learned from the worst possible teacher what kind of leader he never wanted to become, that Davison's cruelty had taught him more about management than any business school could have offered, and that yes, there was personal satisfaction in this moment, but the real goal was to prove that businesses could succeed without sacrificing humanity on the altar of profit margins. Marcus added that Davison Technologies' employees deserved better than what they had received, that clients deserved better service than what the company had been providing, and that the industry would be better with one less example of the kind of corporate culture that treated people as disposable machines. Davison stood and walked back to his window, staring out at the city while Marcus waited in silence. And when the CEO finally spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that suggested the fight had gone out of him. Davison said that he was 63 years old and tired, that the business world had changed in ways that made him feel obsolete and irrelevant, and that perhaps it was time to step away and let someone else try their hand at steering the ship. He would accept $41 million, splitting the difference between their positions, if VentureTech could close within 60 days, and if Marcus agreed to retain all current employees for at least 6 months to ensure business continuity. Marcus recognized this as surrender disguised as compromise, understanding that Davison was trying to salvage some dignity from a situation that had stripped away his power and control. They shook hands this time, a formal and cold gesture that represented business agreement rather than any personal reconciliation, and Marcus left the office knowing that his life had just changed in ways he had barely begun to process. The next 8 weeks were a whirlwind of legal reviews and financial audits as VentureTech's team examined every aspect of Davison Technologies' operations with microscopic attention, uncovering problems that ranged from concerning to appalling. The company's code base was poorly documented and riddled with technical debt, years of rushed projects, and inadequate testing, creating a fragile system that somehow continued functioning through momentum and luck. Employee morale was even worse than Karen's warnings had suggested, with exit interviews revealing pattern after pattern of workers driven away by impossible demands and lack of appreciation. Several major clients were actively seeking alternative vendors, frustrated by missed deadlines and inadequate support, relationships hanging by threads that would snap at any moment without immediate intervention. Marcus read these reports late at night after Emma had gone to bed, sitting in his home office while Sarah worked on her design projects, and he felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders like a physical burden. Some of VentureTech's investors expressed concern that the acquisition was more complicated and risky than initial analysis had suggested, that perhaps the smart move would be to renegotiate the price downward or walk away entirely. Marcus understood their worries, but he had seen something in those employee interviews that strengthened his resolve. Stories of talented people trapped in a toxic system who wanted desperately to do good work, but had been systematically prevented from flourishing. These were not bad employees, but good people in a bad situation, and Marcus became convinced that liberating them from Davison's legacy would transform the combined company into something extraordinary. He made calls to clients who were considering leaving, speaking with honesty about the problems they had experienced and presenting his vision for how VentureTech's acquisition would address those failures through better management and renewed focus on quality. Many of these conversations went better than Marcus had dared hope, with clients expressing willingness to give the company another chance under new leadership that seemed to actually care about delivering value. The final due diligence report was completed 3 days before the deadline, a massive document that laid out every risk and liability in exhaustive detail. Marcus's leadership team gathered for a final decision meeting, knowing that signing the acquisition agreement would commit them to a path that could either accelerate their growth dramatically or destroy everything they had built. Marcus walked through the risks honestly, acknowledging that the integration would be harder than they had initially projected, that costs would be higher and timeline longer, and that some aspects of Davison Technologies might be beyond saving. Then he shared the stories from those employee interviews, reading aloud comments from workers who talked about loving their craft, but hating their workplace, about wanting to innovate but being constrained by bureaucracy and fear, about staying only because they needed jobs but dreaming of somewhere better. These testimonials shifted the emotional tenor of the meeting, reminding everyone that business decisions affected real lives, and when Marcus called for a vote, the result was unanimous to proceed. VentureTech issued a press release announcing the acquisition on a Monday morning, carefully crafted language, explaining that the merger would create a stronger combined company capable of delivering enhanced value to clients while preserving jobs and institutional knowledge. The business press picked up the story immediately because acquisitions always generated interest, but this one had an unusual angle: the fact that VentureTech's founder had previously worked at the company he was now purchasing. Some reporters dug deeper and discovered Marcus's termination after his daughter's birth, and suddenly, the story transformed from routine business news into a human interest narrative about justice and vindication that spread across social media and news websites. Marcus gave interviews explaining that the acquisition was primarily a business decision based on strategic fit and market opportunity, carefully avoiding triumphalist language, while acknowledging that his personal history with Davison Technologies gave him unique insight into what needed to change. Richard Davison announced his retirement on the same day, releasing a statement that praised Davison Technologies' accomplishments over 3 decades, while expressing confidence that VentureTech's leadership would guide the company into a new era of success. The statement was gracious on the surface, but Marcus detected bitterness in the phrasing, subtle word choices that suggested Davison saw this transition as defeat rather than evolution. Some industry analysts praised the acquisition as a smart move that would benefit both companies, while others questioned whether VentureTech was taking on more than it could handle, whether Marcus's relative inexperience would prove fatal when managing a larger and more complex organization. Marcus read these opinions with detached interest, understanding that speculation meant nothing compared to the hard work of execution that lay ahead, that proving the skeptics wrong would require years of sustained effort rather than eloquent press releases. The reaction from Davison Technologies employees ranged from cautious optimism to outright celebration, with many workers admitting they had been seeking other jobs and were willing to give the new ownership a chance to improve conditions. Marcus scheduled an all-hands meeting for his first day as owner, standing in front of 300 people in the company's largest conference room, while feeling the same nervousness he had experienced before pitching his first client years ago. He spoke without notes or slides, simply sharing his story about being fired for wanting to be present at his daughter's birth, about the anger and humiliation that had driven him to build VentureTech, and about his vision for transforming Davison Technologies into a workplace that honored employees as human beings rather than treating them as disposable resources. Marcus acknowledged that trust would need to be earned through action rather than promised through words, but he committed that every policy and decision would be guided by respect for workers and families, that parental leave would be protected rather than punished, and that flexibility and work-life balance would be principles rather than slogans. The first 90 days after closing the acquisition were brutal and exhilarating in equal measure. Endless 14-hour days, solving crises, and implementing changes, while trying to maintain some presence in Emma's life and support Sarah through her own demanding projects. Marcus divided his time between VentureTech's original office and the former Davison Technologies headquarters, working to integrate systems and cultures while reassuring clients and employees that the transition would be managed carefully. He appointed several of VentureTech's senior leaders to key positions in the acquired company, bringing in people who embodied the values and work ethic he wanted to instill throughout the combined organization. The symbolic changes happened quickly, with Davison Technologies renamed as VentureTech Solutions and the old corporate branding replaced with designs that emphasized innovation and humanity, but the deeper cultural transformation would take months or years to fully accomplish. Marcus instituted immediate policy changes that sent shockwaves through the former Davison Technologies workforce, implementing generous parental leave for all employees regardless of gender or position, creating flexible work arrangements for people with caregiving responsibilities, and increasing salaries for workers who had been systematically underpaid under the previous ownership. These changes were expensive in the short term, but Marcus saw them as essential investments in morale and retention, proving through concrete action that the new management was serious about creating a different kind of workplace. He also began the painful process of addressing the technical debt in the code base, allocating resources to refactoring and documentation that had been neglected for years, accepting that this work would delay some new features but would create a more sustainable foundation for future growth. Some of the former Davison Technologies managers resisted the changes, comfortable with the old hierarchical culture where they had wielded power through fear and intimidation, rather than inspiration and collaboration. Marcus had anticipated this resistance and dealt with it swiftly, making it clear that leaders who could not embrace the new values would be helped to find opportunities elsewhere, that VentureTech solutions needed champions of change rather than defenders of the old regime. Several senior managers chose to leave during the first 6 months, and while their departures created short-term disruption, the remaining workforce responded with increased energy and creativity as they realized the toxic culture was truly being dismantled. New leaders emerged from within the ranks, talented people who had been suppressed under Davison's management, but who flourished when given authority and support to implement their ideas. 6 months after the acquisition closed, Marcus sat in his office late one evening writing a letter that he had been composing in his head for years. The letter was addressed to Richard Davison at his retirement home in Arizona, where the former CEO had retreated to play golf and nurse his wounded pride far from the business he had lost. Marcus wrote about the journey from that terrible day in the hospital corridor to this moment of unexpected triumph, acknowledging the rage that had fueled his initial efforts to build VentureTech, but explaining how that rage had gradually transformed into something more productive and meaningful. He described the changes at the newly merged company, the employees who were thriving under leadership that respected their humanity, the clients who were renewing contracts because service had improved dramatically, and the culture that was slowly healing from decades of toxicity and fear. Marcus wrote that he was grateful to Davison in a strange and paradoxical way, that the cruelty of his termination had forced him to discover capabilities and strength he might never have found in the comfortable numbness of being an employee. Without that betrayal, he would never have built VentureTech, never have learned to lead with compassion and integrity, never have created a workplace where people like him could be both dedicated professionals and present parents. Marcus wrote that he hoped Davison would reflect on the lessons of their shared history, would recognize that businesses built on exploitation and fear were ultimately hollow achievements that enriched bank accounts while impoverishing souls. The letter ended with a simple statement that Marcus felt no personal animosity toward Davison anymore, that he had moved beyond revenge into something approaching forgiveness, but that he would spend the rest of his career proving that success did not require sacrificing humanity or punishing workers for having families. Marcus sealed the letter and mailed it without telling anyone, not even Sarah, because this gesture was something he needed to do for his own closure rather than for any response or acknowledgement. He never received a reply, and he did not expect one. Understanding that Davison would likely read the letter as salt in wounds rather than as the offering of peace that Marcus had intended. It did not matter because Marcus had written the letter for himself, as a way of marking how far he had traveled from that broken man in the hospital corridor to the leader of a company that employed over 500 people and generated $50 million in annual revenue. The act of writing and sending that letter allowed Marcus to finally release the last threads of anger that had been woven through his success, to move forward motivated by positive vision rather than by memories of injustice. Emma was 5 years old when she asked the question that would haunt Marcus for days afterward, sitting at the kitchen table, coloring a picture of their family, while Sarah prepared dinner, and Marcus reviewed quarterly reports on his laptop. Emma looked up from her drawing and asked with the innocent directness of children why Daddy had to work so much, why he was always on his phone or computer even when he was home, why he sometimes seemed sad or distracted when she was trying to show him something important. The question hit Marcus like a punch to the chest, because he realized with horrible clarity that he had been repeating some of the same mistakes he had criticized in his former employers, that his commitment to building a company that honored work-life balance had somehow blinded him to his own failure to maintain that balance in his personal life. Marcus closed his laptop and got down on the floor with Emma, looking at her drawing which showed their family holding hands in front of their house, with the sun shining overhead and flowers blooming in impossible colors. He told Emma that she was absolutely right to call him out, that Daddy had been working too much and not paying enough attention to the most important people in his life, and that he was going to make some changes starting immediately. Sarah joined them on the floor, and they had a family discussion about priorities and time, about how success in business meant nothing if it came at the cost of missing Emma's childhood, about how the whole point of building VentureTech had been to create a world where parents could be present for their children. Marcus made commitments that evening about being home for dinner at least 5 nights a week, about leaving his phone in another room during family time, about taking real vacations where work emails would go unanswered, and he asked Emma and Sarah to hold him accountable when he inevitably slipped back into old habits. The next morning, Marcus called a leadership team meeting and shared what had happened with Emma, acknowledging that he had been modeling exactly the wrong kind of behavior for a company that supposedly prioritized work-life balance. He announced new policies that would start with himself and cascade through the organization, limiting after-hours email expectations, creating protected family time where leaders were explicitly forbidden from working, and implementing mandatory vacation time that could not be deferred or skipped. Some of his executives looked uncomfortable with these policies, admitting they had been working evenings and weekends partly because they felt Marcus's own schedule set an implicit expectation, and Marcus realized he had been perpetuating problematic culture through example, even while preaching different values through policy. The recognition was humbling, but also clarifying, reminding Marcus that leadership required constant vigilance about the gap between stated values and actual behavior, that creating a genuinely human-centered workplace demanded more than just good intentions and generous benefits. VentureTech solutions became something of a phenomenon in business circles, as word spread about their unconventional management philosophy and impressive results, with case studies appearing in business school, curricula, and articles in management journals, analyzing what made the company successful. Industry conferences invited Marcus to speak about leadership and culture, and he found himself becoming a reluctant evangelist for treating employees with dignity and respect, arguing that ethical business practices were not just morally right, but also strategically smart in competitive markets. Marcus shared the story of his termination and subsequent journey with audiences of executives and entrepreneurs, many of whom responded with their own stories of being burned by toxic workplaces or struggling to balance career ambitions with family responsibilities. These conversations convinced Marcus that his experience was not unique but emblematic of broader problems in corporate culture, that countless talented people were being driven away from traditional employment by companies that demanded total sacrifice while offering minimal loyalty in return. The company's financial performance backed up Marcus's philosophical arguments, with VentureTech solutions growing at 30% annually while maintaining employee retention rates far above industry averages and receiving client satisfaction scores that competitors could not match. Some skeptics argued that the company's success was due to lucky market timing or Marcus's technical expertise rather than their management approach, but comparison with similar firms suggested that culture really did make a measurable difference in outcomes. Employees who felt respected and supported worked harder and more creatively. Clients who received excellent service remained loyal and referred new business, and the positive reputation attracted top talent who wanted to work somewhere that aligned with their values. Marcus watched competitors begin to imitate some of VentureTech Solutions' policies, often in shallow or performative ways that maintained underlying toxic cultures. But even imperfect imitation suggested that the industry was slowly beginning to recognize that the old models of exploitation and fear were becoming obsolete. Marcus was profiled in business magazines with headlines about redemption and revolution, photographs showing him in casual clothes, surrounded by his team, rather than in formal executive portraits behind mahogany desks. Some of these articles bordered on hagiography that made Marcus uncomfortable, painting him as a visionary hero rather than simply someone trying to run a decent company after being mistreated by an indecent one. He pushed back against this narrative in interviews, emphasizing that VentureTech Solutions' approach was not radical or innovative, but simply treating people the way any ethical organization should, that respecting workers' humanity should be considered basic decency rather than revolutionary management theory. Marcus worried that being positioned as some kind of business prophet would set expectations he could not meet, that eventually he would make mistakes, or the company would face setbacks that would be interpreted as proof that ethical business was impractical idealism. But he continued accepting speaking engagements because the platform allowed him to influence other leaders and potentially improve conditions for workers beyond his own company. By the time Emma turned 8, VentureTech Solutions employed over 1,000 people across multiple offices and generated annual revenue exceeding $200 million, success that seemed impossible when Marcus remembered those desperate months after his termination, when finding any job had seemed like an unreachable dream. The company had expanded beyond custom software development into product creation, launching several successful applications that served niche markets, with tools designed through deep customer research and iterative development. Marcus had built a leadership team he trusted completely talented executives who shared his values and could manage day-to-day operations without his constant oversight, giving him more time to focus on strategy and on his family. Sarah's design career had flourished alongside VentureTech Solutions' growth, with several major clients and a growing reputation for elegant and user-friendly visual communication, and she had been able to structure her work around Emma's school schedule in ways that made her happy and fulfilled. But success brought its own complications and pressures that Marcus had not fully anticipated: the weight of responsibility for 1,000 families who depended on the company's continued growth and stability. Economic downturns and market shifts that would once have been abstract news stories now represented existential threats, requiring careful navigation and difficult decisions. Marcus faced choices about expanding into new markets or maintaining focus, about acquiring smaller companies or growing organically, about how much growth was necessary versus how much was simply feeding ego or investor expectations. He struggled with knowing when to push for more and when to be satisfied with what had been achieved, understanding that ambition could be either fuel for positive impact or a trap that sacrificed present happiness for perpetually deferred future rewards. Some of the original VentureTech employees who had joined in the early days expressed frustration that the company had lost some of its scrappy startup energy, that the necessary processes and structures for managing a large organization had created bureaucracy they found stifling. Marcus understood their concerns because he sometimes felt the same nostalgia for simpler times, but he also recognized that growing a company meant accepting that it would change and that not everyone would be happy with those changes. He tried to maintain channels for innovation and autonomy within the larger corporate structure, creating small teams with significant freedom to experiment and develop new ideas. but it was impossible to recreate the desperation and intimacy of those first years above the dry cleaner. Marcus made peace with this reality by remembering that the goal had never been to build a perfect company, but rather to build one that treated people well while delivering value to clients, and by that measure VentureTech Solutions was succeeding even if it no longer felt like the scrappy underdog fighting against impossible odds. Marcus was preparing for a board meeting on a Tuesday afternoon when his assistant informed him that someone named Richard Davison was in the lobby requesting a few minutes of his time without an appointment. Marcus felt his chest tighten with surprise and apprehension, having not seen or spoken to his former tormentor in nearly 7 years since the acquisition closed. His first instinct was to refuse the meeting, to maintain the clean separation he had established by sending that letter and moving on with his life, but curiosity and perhaps some remnant of unfinished business made him agree to 15 minutes. Davison looked much older than Marcus remembered, his silver hair now completely white, and his face lined with deep wrinkles that suggested illness or hardship, walking with a slight stoop that aged him beyond his 70 years. They sat in Marcus's office with the door closed, an awkward silence hanging between them until Davison began speaking in a voice that shook slightly with emotion or perhaps with the effects of age. The former CEO said he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months earlier, that doctors had given him perhaps another year at most, and that facing death had forced him to confront regrets and failures he had spent his career avoiding through work and willful blindness. Davison said he had read Marcus's letter dozens of times over the years, initially with anger and dismissal, but gradually with growing recognition that every accusation and observation had been accurate and deserved. He had built a financially successful company, but had destroyed countless lives in the process, had accumulated wealth and status while bankrupting himself spiritually, and now at the end of his life, he was surrounded by money, but not by people who genuinely cared whether he lived or died. Davison said he was not asking for forgiveness because he understood he had no right to expect grace after the cruelty he had demonstrated, but he wanted Marcus to know that he had been wrong about everything that mattered, that his entire philosophy of business had been poisonous to himself as much as to his employees. The older man's eyes filled with tears as he talked about reading articles about VentureTech Solutions, success, about seeing Marcus praised for the kind of leadership that Davison had always dismissed as soft and impractical, about recognizing too late that his former employee had understood fundamental truths that he had spent a lifetime denying. Davison said he had tried to reach out to other people he had harmed over the years, but many refused to speak with him, and he would understand if Marcus wanted him to leave immediately without further conversation. Marcus sat quietly through this confession, processing complex emotions that ranged from vindication to pity to a strange sorrow for the broken man sitting across from him. Marcus thought about sending Davison away with cold words about reaping what he had sown, about karma and justice, and the deserved consequences of building success on others' suffering. But looking at the dying man who had once held absolute power over his life, Marcus found he could not summon the cruelty that would mirror what had been done to him, could not become the thing he had spent years defining himself against. He told Davison that he appreciated hearing this acknowledgement, that it took courage to face one's failures and mistakes, and that while he could not forget what had happened, he had genuinely moved beyond hatred into something approaching neutral distance. Marcus said that Davison's cruelty had inadvertently created the circumstances for something better to emerge, that VentureTech Solutions existed because the old system had failed so catastrophically, and that perhaps there was meaning in that transformation, even if it came from such painful origins. They talked for over an hour, far longer than Marcus had intended, with Davison asking questions about how Marcus had managed to build the company culture that had eluded him despite decades of experience. Marcus explained that it had not been complicated or mysterious, that treating people with basic decency and respect created conditions where talent could flourish, that investing in employees' well-being paid returns that far exceeded the costs, and that leadership through service and example was more effective than leadership through fear and intimidation. Davison listened with the attention of someone who had finally become teachable after a lifetime of certainty, and he said that he wished he could go back and rebuild his career with this understanding, though he recognized that wish was pointless given his terminal diagnosis. Marcus felt unexpected compassion for this man who had destroyed his life, recognizing that Davison's greatest punishment was not losing his company, but living with the knowledge of wasted opportunity and unnecessary cruelty. When they finally stood to say goodbye, Davison extended his hand, and Marcus shook it, a gesture very different from their cold business handshake years before. Davison thanked Marcus for his time and his grace, saying he would die more peacefully knowing that at least one of his victims had found success and happiness despite his interference. Marcus walked the older man to the elevator and watched him disappear behind closing doors, then returned to his office and sat quietly for a long time before calling Sarah to describe what had just happened. Sarah listened without judgment and then said something that crystallized the entire encounter, that showing grace to someone who did not deserve it was perhaps the ultimate victory, proof that Marcus had become so secure in his success and values that he could afford generosity even to his former oppressor. Marcus realized she was right, that his willingness to spend an hour with Davison without gloating or punishing demonstrated how completely he had moved beyond the need for revenge into genuine peace with his past and confidence in his present. Emma entered high school as a confident and curious young woman who had grown up watching her parents build careers that aligned with their values, who had never questioned that work and family should exist in balance rather than in conflict. She showed talent for both programming and design, interests that seemed to combine her parents' strengths, and she sometimes worked on small projects with VentureTech Solutions employees who treated her like a junior colleague rather than just the boss's kid. Marcus made sure never to pressure Emma about her future career, having learned from his own experience that forcing predetermined paths destroyed the joy of discovery, but he took quiet pride in seeing her explore possibilities with the security of knowing her family would support whatever direction she chose. Sarah had been talking about writing a book about work-life integration for creative professionals, using their family's story as one case study among many, and Marcus encouraged her to pursue the project even though it meant their private struggles would become more public. VentureTech Solutions had established a foundation that provided scholarships and support for parents pursuing entrepreneurship, offering funding and mentorship for people who wanted to build businesses that honored work-life balance. The foundation received hundreds of applications each year from talented individuals, with stories eerily similar to Marcus's own. People who had been fired for taking medical leave, or discriminated against for having children, or forced to choose between career advancement and family responsibilities. Marcus met with many of these applicants personally, sharing his journey and offering advice that went beyond business strategy to address the emotional and psychological challenges of building something new after experiencing betrayal and rejection. Some of the foundation's scholarship recipients had gone on to build successful companies of their own, creating a multiplier effect where ethical business practices spread through the ecosystem as each generation of entrepreneurs modeled better behavior for the next. Industry organizations had begun adopting family-friendly policies partly because of VentureTech Solutions' example, recognizing that companies championing work-life balance were attracting the best talent and achieving superior results. These policy changes were imperfect and often implemented superficially, but they represented progress that would have seemed impossible when Marcus was fired for wanting to attend his daughter's birth. Marcus received awards and recognition that he accepted graciously, while always emphasizing that he was not unique or heroic, that countless other people had faced similar injustices, and many had responded with equal or greater determination. He used speaking opportunities to highlight other entrepreneurs and leaders who were building ethical businesses, deliberately sharing the spotlight rather than allowing himself to become the sole symbol of this movement. Understanding that lasting change required a community of champions rather than dependence on any single individual. 10 years after launching VentureTech, Marcus was invited to speak at a major technology conference on a panel about the future of work and corporate culture. The panel included several prominent CEOs, and one slot that surprised Marcus when he saw the roster: a professor who had written extensively about management philosophy and who happened to be Richard Davison's daughter. Marcus had not known that Davison had children, having never learned much about the man's personal life, and he felt apprehensive about what this encounter might bring given the complicated history between the families. The professor, whose name was Rachel, approached Marcus before the panel began and introduced herself with a warm smile that seemed genuine rather than forced, saying she had wanted to meet him for years after hearing so much about him from her father during his final illness. Rachel explained that watching Marcus build VentureTech Solutions had been a catalyst for her father's eventual recognition of his failures, that Davison had followed the company's progress obsessively and had gradually come to see Marcus's success as both indictment and inspiration. She said her relationship with her father had been strained for most of her life because his workaholism and emotional unavailability had damaged his family as much as his employees. But their conversations during his final year had achieved a level of honesty and connection that partially redeemed decades of distance. Rachel told Marcus that her father had died peacefully 2 years after their meeting, and that among his final words had been an expression of gratitude that he had lived long enough to see that a better way was possible, that businesses could succeed without requiring leaders to sacrifice their humanity. Marcus felt unexpected emotion hearing this, realizing that even the cruelest people contained capacity for growth and redemption if they could find the courage to face their failures. The panel discussion was lively and sometimes contentious, as the CEOs debated whether family-friendly policies were practical luxuries that only successful companies could afford or fundamental principles that created conditions for success. Marcus argued forcefully for the latter position, sharing data from VentureTech Solutions and similar companies demonstrating that ethical practices drove better financial outcomes over time, that short-term thinking about maximizing immediate profits ultimately destroyed long-term value. Rachel contributed academic research supporting Marcus's points, while also acknowledging the structural challenges that made change difficult: the quarterly earnings pressures and shareholder expectations that pushed leaders toward exploitation even when they personally believed in better approaches. The audience responded enthusiastically to the discussion, with several people commenting afterward that hearing Rachel and Marcus speak together, despite their complicated history through her father, had been powerful evidence that transformation was possible at individual and organizational levels. VentureTech Solutions celebrated its 20th anniversary with a company-wide event that brought together employees from all offices, a festival-like gathering featuring food and music and speeches that celebrated both past achievements and future aspirations. Marcus stood on stage looking out at 3,000 employees, an impossible number when he remembered that first tiny team working above the dry cleaner, and he felt gratitude so intense it threatened to overwhelm his ability to speak. He talked about the journey from betrayal to triumph, acknowledging the anger that had fueled the early days, but emphasizing how that anger had transformed into genuine passion for building something better, for proving that success did not require cruelty and exploitation. Marcus thanked his team for trusting his vision and for embodying the values that made VentureTech solutions special, for being living proof that treating people well created better outcomes for everyone involved. Emma was now 22 years old and working in VentureTech Solutions Innovation Lab, having joined the company after college, with the explicit understanding that she would receive no special treatment and would need to prove herself through her contributions rather than her last name. Marcus was proud of how seriously Emma took this commitment, how she worked alongside colleagues without pulling rank or expecting privileges, and how she brought fresh perspectives that came from growing up in a world shaped partly by her parents' example. Sarah had published her book to strong reviews and healthy sales, using the platform to advocate for systemic changes in how workplaces treated parents and caregivers, and she had become a sought-after consultant, helping companies design policies that genuinely supported work-life balance rather than just paying lip service to the concept. The Chen family had built something together that went beyond any single company or career, a living demonstration that personal values and professional success could align rather than conflict. During the anniversary celebration, Marcus announced the creation of a new initiative that would take VentureTech Solutions' mission beyond its own walls in more ambitious ways. The company would be launching a venture fund specifically to invest in businesses led by people who had experienced workplace discrimination or wrongful termination, providing not just capital, but also mentorship and resources to help these entrepreneurs build companies that embodied ethical principles from their foundations. Marcus explained that this fund represented a systematic attempt to address the structural problems that had made his own mistreatment possible, to create alternative paths for talented people who had been rejected by traditional employers because they prioritized family or pushed back against toxic cultures. The announcement received enthusiastic applause from the assembled employees, many of whom had personal stories of being undervalued or mistreated before finding their way to VentureTech Solutions, and Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that his company's success would now enable other people to write their own redemption stories. Marcus was 53 years old when he decided to step back from day-to-day leadership of VentureTech Solutions, appointing a successor from within the company while transitioning to a chairman role focused on strategy and culture rather than operations. The decision was not about retirement, but about recognizing that the company had grown beyond what any single person could or should control, that sustainable organizations needed leadership succession plans rather than dependence on founder personalities. Marcus wanted to spend more time with Sarah and Emma, to invest in the venture fund and foundation, to write and speak and mentor without the consuming demands of managing a large corporation. He had achieved more than he had imagined possible during those desperate months after Emma's birth, had transformed personal catastrophe into professional triumph, but he understood that success was not primarily about the size of his company or the extent of his wealth, but rather about the lives he had touched and the systems he had changed. The story of VentureTech Solutions had become business legend, taught in classes, and cited in books as an example of how ethical leadership created competitive advantage and how personal adversity could be channeled into positive change. Marcus received regular invitations to speak at universities and conferences, to advise government committees examining workplace policy, to consult with companies trying to build better cultures. He accepted many of these opportunities, while being careful not to let them consume the time he wanted to devote to family and personal interests, maintaining the balance that had been central to his philosophy from the beginning. Marcus knew that his example was valuable but not unique, that countless other people had faced similar injustices without the combination of skills, timing, and luck that had enabled him to build a successful response, and he felt responsibility to use his platform to advocate for systemic changes that would protect all workers rather than just the exceptional few who could become entrepreneurs. Emma asked her father one evening what he considered his greatest achievement, whether it was building VentureTech solutions from nothing, or transforming Davison Technologies, or creating the foundation and venture fund. Marcus thought carefully before answering that his greatest achievement was being present for her childhood, despite all the pressures and distractions that could have pulled him away, that no professional success could compare to the relationships he had maintained with the people he loved. He told Emma that Richard Davison had died wealthy but alone, surrounded by material success, but bankrupt in the measures that actually mattered, and that avoiding that fate required constant vigilance about priorities and values. Marcus said he hoped the example he and Sarah had tried to set would influence how Emma approached her own career and family, not by following some predetermined path, but by maintaining integrity about what truly mattered, even when the world pushed toward different priorities. The acquisition offer Marcus had sent to Richard Davison 20 years earlier remained framed on his office wall, not as a trophy of revenge, but as a reminder of how completely life could transform when a person refused to accept defeat as final. Marcus sometimes showed that framed letter to young entrepreneurs visiting his office, using it to tell the story of his journey from humiliation to triumph, emphasizing that the real victory was not destroying his enemy, but building something positive from the ashes of betrayal. He explained that revenge was a hollow goal if pursued as an end in itself, but that channeling anger into constructive creation could produce outcomes that served justice while also serving the broader good. The letter represented a moment when personal vindication and business strategy had aligned perfectly, but Marcus wanted people to understand that such moments were launching points rather than destinations, that the real work of building ethical organizations required decades of sustained effort rather than single dramatic gestures. VentureTech Solutions had become one of the most valuable private technology companies in the country, with annual revenue exceeding $2 billion and a company culture that remained remarkably consistent with the values Marcus had articulated in that first awkward pitch to potential employees above the dry cleaner. The company regularly topped lists of best places to work, not because of lavish perks or high salaries, but because of genuine commitment to treating employees as whole human beings with lives beyond their professional roles. Turnover was minimal compared to industry averages, productivity was exceptional, and client satisfaction remained consistently high, all metrics demonstrating that ethical business practices delivered tangible results rather than representing idealistic luxuries that successful companies could afford as afterthoughts. Marcus took satisfaction in these outcomes while recognizing that the real measure of success was the thousands of people who had built careers and lives at VentureTech Solutions without experiencing the cruelty and exploitation that characterized so many corporate environments. The venture fund had invested in over 50 companies, founded by people with stories similar to Marcus, creating a network of ethical businesses that supported each other and spread human-centered management practices throughout the industry. Some of these companies had failed because entrepreneurship always involved risk regardless of values, but the success rate was higher than typical venture portfolios because the fund provided extensive support and mentorship rather than just capital. Marcus took particular pride in seeing other people achieve their own versions of redemption, turning personal setbacks into professional achievements that proved the possibility of second acts and comebacks. The foundation had awarded hundreds of scholarships and helped countless parents launch businesses or pursue education while maintaining family responsibilities, multiplying the impact of Marcus's original story through many individual journeys. These initiatives represented the fullest expression of Marcus's vision, the recognition that his personal triumph meant little unless it opened doors for others facing similar barriers and injustices. Marcus Chen understood that his story would continue evolving long after he stopped actively leading VentureTech solutions, that the company and its values would either endure or fade based on whether they had been embedded deeply enough to survive changes in leadership and market conditions. He had worked deliberately to ensure sustainability through strong culture and distributed leadership rather than dependence on any single visionary figure, recognizing that personality-driven organizations rarely outlived their founders, with missions intact. The succession planning that had consumed significant effort in recent years was designed to preserve what mattered about VentureTech solutions while allowing necessary adaptation to changing circumstances, to maintain commitment to ethical principles, while remaining flexible about specific practices and strategies. Marcus felt confident that the next generation of leaders understood what the company stood for and would defend those values even when faced with pressure to compromise for short-term gains. On the 20th anniversary of the day, he was fired for wanting to hold his newborn daughter. Marcus gathered his family for a quiet dinner at home, wanting to mark the occasion privately rather than with any public celebration or ceremony. Sarah and Emma joined him in raising glasses to toast the journey they had traveled together, acknowledging both the pain of the beginning and the joy of where they had arrived. Marcus looked at his daughter, now a confident young woman building her own career and life, and at his wife, still his partner and best friend after decades of navigating challenges together, and he felt a contentment deeper than any professional achievement could provide. This was the real victory. These relationships preserved and strengthened through crisis. This family that had refused to be destroyed by one man's cruelty and had instead built something beautiful from the ruins of that initial betrayal. Emma asked her parents what advice they would give to anyone facing similar circumstances, sudden termination, or professional betrayal that seemed to destroy their future. Marcus and Sarah looked at each other and then spoke together about the importance of not letting bitterness become identity, about channeling anger into constructive action rather than destructive obsession, about remembering that revenge was sweetest when it took the form of building something better than what was lost. They talked about the value of maintaining faith in justice, even when it seemed distant or impossible, about the power of treating others well even after being treated badly, about the necessity of balancing ambition with presence for the people who mattered most. Marcus added that his greatest regret was not anything he had done, but rather the years it had taken him to fully embrace the work-life balance he claimed to value, the times he had let business demands pull him away from family moments that could never be recovered. He hoped Emma would learn from his mistakes as well as his successes, would build her life with clearer priorities from the beginning rather than needing crisis to force recognition of what truly mattered. The evening ended with Marcus holding Sarah close, while Emma worked on a project in the next room, the simple domestic scene representing everything he had fought to preserve and create. The framed acquisition offer hung in his home office nearby, visible through the doorway, that piece of paper representing both the lowest and highest moments of his life, joined together in ironic symmetry. Marcus thought about Richard Davison sometimes, wondering if the old man had truly found peace before dying or had carried regret to his final breath, and he felt gratitude for the second chance. He had been given to choose what kind of person he would become in response to injustice. The choice to build rather than destroy, to lift others rather than crush them, to lead with compassion rather than fear had made all the difference in creating a life worth living and a legacy worth leaving. This was the story Marcus hoped would endure beyond his lifetime, not as a tale of revenge, but as a testament to resilience, not as a celebration of defeating enemies, but as an example of transforming betrayal into blessing through determination, integrity, and love that refused to surrender to bitterness.